Hello and welcome to Talent Included 2025 LinkedIn Live series. You might have seen us pop up on your feed over the last couple of years with our Can Recruitment Crack Inequality series we do with a lovely Joe Major. And that's going to be returning over the next couple of weeks. But in 2025, we also wanted to use our platform here at Talent Included to highlight some of the other DEI practitioners and consultants that we have the pleasure of working with, and highlighting, I think, some of the key challenges our clients are facing in this space. So for those of you who don't know, Talent Included is a EDI consultancy. We are on a mission to make every workplace accessible, equitable and inclusive. And we help clients, with targeted DEI initiatives and programs, and also help them secure the best DEI talent in the market. So to kick off our 2025 series, I have invited the incredible Hira Gudka back for a session on understanding freedom of expression and belief in the workplace. So thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you're hot off a plane from Berlin over the weekend, but it's great to have you here this morning. Thank you so much. Now, Hira is the co-founder of Convergent. I said co-founder. You are the founder of Convergent, an EDI consultancy, and you've been in business since about 2014, haven't you?
That's right. I've been working in EDI since late 2014, so a good 10 years now.
Fantastic. And I know that you work with a whole host of clients, public sector, private sector, third sector organizations. And I know that you've got a whole kind of suite of standalone workshops that you deliver. You curate 6 to 12 month learning journeys for a lot of your clients, and supporting, I think I probably sum it up by you support senior leadership and people teams being, instrumental in creating these inclusive cultures. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It's always helpful to run awareness raising workshops for your overall employee base. But the real change happens if your leadership teams and if your people teams really, really are able to handle some of the trickier inclusion subjects that can come up. And that's what I really get to grips with, or help my clients get to grips with.
I love it. And, having been on these sessions and kind of watched you in flow, it is brilliant. It's brilliant what you do. So, and I appreciate you're a really busy lady. So thank you so much for spending the time with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
No worries. And I know that, a lot of your work, I know you did a lot of work in the kind of sexual harassment space. I know that we've had you on as a guest to talk about that before. But really today we wanted to talk about freedom of expression and religion and or belief in the workplace. And I know that you've, done extensive work with employment lawyers. You looked at a lot of analysis, you had lots of guidance and really identifying the critical gaps that organizations have and how unprepared they are, I think is probably fair to say, when we are, managing and navigating our way through the complexities of balancing individual beliefs and organizational values. So kind of, I think the first question I've got is kind of what brought you to start this work?
Specifically, handling these conflicts?
Yeah, these ones specifically, yeah.
Yeah, so what I've been noticing more and more of through my conversations with HR professionals, in-house HR teams, is that they themselves aren't sure how to deal with these situations. And that is being borne out through tribunal statistics, because apparently I have read that around 80% of employers who end up at tribunal because of philosophical belief conflicts are losing those tribunals because they aren't getting the basics right. They're not able to handle the conflict in the workplace. They're dealing with it so badly that they are then ending up at tribunals and suffering really quite significant reputational damage and, of course, financial damage. So there's these reputational and financial risks at play. And the reason why this is happening is people are forgetting, and unfortunately a lot of HR people are forgetting, that a belief held by a colleague doesn't have to be held by anyone else, but it can still be protected. And not only are they forgetting that, but they're not particularly confidently handling these situations that are occurring between colleagues. And that's what's going wrong. And in their failure to manage that conflict, what they're ending up doing is trampling over people's individual rights that we very much have, our freedom of expression rights, which is enshrined in human rights legislation.
I want to come on to all of these points, but yeah, absolutely. Brilliant.
Sorry, I'm racing ahead.
No, you're not. It's only because I really want to do a deep dive on all of these points, because I think, and so sorry for interrupting, but yeah, we'll definitely come on to this, because I think today what I wanted to do with you is, explore some of these challenges that organizations are facing with balancing these individual beliefs with these organizational values. I think that, to the point that you just made is something we absolutely need to explore. I think you then kind of went on to talk about what what freedom of expression is, in terms of religion or belief, and how that kind of manifests in the workplace. Not manifests in the workplace, but how it, it's demonstrated in the workplace, and the repercussions that can have. So I think I want to talk about that. I want to, if we can, and hopefully we've got time to, equip some HR leaders and D&I practitioners with some tools to be able to manage those conflicts relating to freedom of expression and belief without compromising the organizational goals or values, and also really kind of bring the conversation to center also around, what it is that we're trying to achieve with D&I, which is, fostering that critical thinking, navigating conflicts, to able to promote and create psychological safety, and for businesses to benefit from all the benefits that are associated with D&I and having lots of different cognitive diversity in the workplace. And I think, before we go on to kind of, trying to explore some of these challenges, I think it's worth saying and noting that businesses today face mounting pressures in an increasingly polarized world, whether that comes from kind of societal divides, political debates, and really shifting cultural norms that demand, if you like, a really thoughtful response from organizations. And I know you're going to talk us through some situations where things haven't gone right and the repercussions that have had. But I think employees and customers expect businesses to take a stand, yet when they do so, they really risk alienating themselves or drawing criticism. And I know that you've seen that kind of play out in a lot of the work that you've done. So I think, balancing these pressures whilst maintaining organizational values is a real challenges that businesses face. And I thought maybe we could kind of start setting the scene by, what is it that we mean by polarization? What is it we mean by kind of beliefs that could be considered to be polarizing, just so we can start, hopefully sparking some kind of interest in terms of, that shows up where I work. Can you give us some examples?
Absolutely. So whether or not in any given workplace a belief is considered controversial, for example, that's going to depend on the people that work there, right? So some examples of beliefs that can cause concern or can raise issues, even though I don't believe they should, is where, let's say, someone has left-wing or right-wing political philosophies, right? Just their belief in the way politics and politicians should run things. Or, for example, a belief in or not believing in vaccination, so having anti-vaccination beliefs, or perhaps gender critical beliefs, ethical veganism. And just recently in October, a tribunal found that a professor's anti-Zionist beliefs were also protected by law. So it's a real range from politics to gender ideology to medicine to even support for Scottish independence. That's another example. So it runs the whole gamut. Things that may surprise you, things that you may not have a problem with, and other things you may have a whole lot of problem with. It really covers anything and everything.
And why do you think these, in terms of them being the most common and trickiest conflicts in the workplace, why do they hold such high risk exposure?
Well, I think people develop an idea of what a good person looks like and what a bad person looks like. And then if we hold on to those ideas very strongly and we use those ideas as a reason for the decisions we might be making about whether or not we reprimand someone, whether or not we say to them, well, you can't post this on your personal social media, or these attitudes aren't welcome in this workplace. That's when organizations are finding themselves in hot water, because they're taking people, and it's people, right? People are taking their ideas of what good is or what bad is, and then judging their colleagues. And that's where they're going wrong.
Interesting. And give me some examples, because I know that you've always got such a keen eye on this tribunal market, the tribunal world, because you always come to the sessions with such amazing examples, because I think it is important to demonstrate how this goes wrong. So are you able to kind of give us some examples of where that has happened? And this is not about kind of naming and shaming organizations. That's not my energy at all. It's more around actually, let's see how this really plays out, because it can be absolutely played out in the organizations that we work in as well.
So I'll give you an example of a case that's been going through various stages of tribunals. So in 2019, an administrator at a school in Gloucestershire was dismissed after sharing on her own Facebook account criticisms of gender identity ideology and teaching about LGBT relationships at school. So there's some key points of the case. So she made these posts under her maiden name, acted based on her faith. She was reported to the school via an email complaint about her social media posts. She was suspended, questioned by her employer, right? Questioned for 6 hours and dismissed for gross misconduct following a disciplinary hearing. And the school said, we have concerns about the posts being potentially discriminatory and harmful to LGBT students. Then what happened was, she argued her dismissal was religious discrimination, that it violated her freedom of expression. So under the Equality Act, religious and philosophical belief are one protected characteristic. So sometimes it's philosophical belief, sometimes it's religious belief, but it falls under the same category under the law. Right. Her case went through several stages. It went to a tribunal, went to the initial tribunal that ruled against her, because this was before gender critical beliefs were recognized as a protected philosophical belief. That happened in 2023. Then an appeal tribunal found in her favor, saying that the original tribunal had erred in law, and the decision was made, or was such, that they said the original tribunal didn't properly consider whether the school's response was proportionate. And that's the key. Where so many employers are getting it wrong, they are not acting with proportionality. And that's what I mean when I talk to people in my workshops, whether they are HR people or otherwise, is our response to things has to be rational and proportionate. But too many HR teams in this case are not being proportionate.
Interesting, really, really interesting. Yeah, and can you give examples of anything else? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just think, actually listening to like kind of real life cases really, really helps.
Yeah, so the case in 2024, most recently, where the appeals tribunal found a professor wasn't discriminating by expressing his anti-Zionist beliefs, found that basically this thread of his disdain for how the Israeli government governs in the region was a very critical part of how he teaches his course. So it wasn't that he was standing up and being anti-Semitic or saying negative things about Jewish people. It's that he was criticizing the Israeli government. And so when a complaint was made against him, and then the university, didn't act proportionately, they ended up at a tribunal and he won. Again, all these things playing out publicly is really bad for organizations. And what is really interesting is that at the moment, at least, I think this is going to change, but at the moment, at least, a big proportion of the employers that are ending up at tribunals are either educational institutes or charities. And there is something going wrong. And I think it's because these sorts of organizations have, at a macro level, that idea that we are good people. So what I was saying before of people saying, oh, I'm a good person, this is what I think good is. Well, charities and schools and universities are literally the organizational equivalent of that. They exist the way that they talk. We are good because of what we do. And so they are, I think that's one of the reasons why these HR teams are so quick to then judge, because it's this whole organizational idea of we are good people, and what you are doing is challenging our idea of what good is.
That's really interesting. So talk to me about I can't even think of the word I'm trying to think, but how are beliefs tested by the law? So at what point are you protected by the law?
Right. So that's a really important question. Employment tribunals use something called the Granger test.
Okay.
And they ask themselves 5 different questions, or at least they consider 5 different things. Number 1, the belief must be genuinely held. You can't just say you believe this thing now because you found yourself in trouble. It must be a belief, not an opinion or a viewpoint based on maybe the latest news story that you've read. It must concern a weighty and substantial aspect of human life or behavior. The belief must attain a level of seriousness, cohesion, and importance. So they will ask questions, right? They're not going to just guess this stuff. They will ask questions of the person and say, well, what about this? Tell me about that. What would you do in this scenario? Or what have you done in this scenario? And the final part is the belief must be worthy of respect in a democratic society and not conflict with other people's rights. And this is the one that quite often people find challenging. They say, well, I don't think this is worthy of respect. But not last year, in 2023, the Court of Appeal clarified that the criteria worthy of respect, that threshold for that is actually pretty low. So only beliefs that are akin to Nazism or totalitarianism would fail. So even beliefs that other people might find offensive can qualify. It has to be a truly heinous belief for it to fail that final criteria.
Interesting. So where do we cross the line then in terms of, your belief, you're expressing a belief and it then becoming, discriminatory in any way?
Yeah, so this is what employers need to be thinking about. They've got to seriously consider all claimed philosophical beliefs, but in terms of what they do in the workplace, they need to focus on managing behavior rather than challenging a person's beliefs. Because like I said near the beginning, human rights legislation protects our right to freedom of expression. The Equality Act protects our right to believe in things that we want to believe. And we should actually be really grateful for that, because there's plenty of countries where people don't have those rights.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Now, before we move on to some practical steps and around, challenging those behaviours, because I think it's such an important point, I want to talk to you because I know that you conducted a survey recently to assess, I suppose, and please correct me if I'm wrong, where the knowledge gaps are surrounding these issues and these challenges in the workplace. Can you share with us, some of the output and some of the results from that survey and what it highlighted to you in terms of gaps?
Yeah. So I asked a couple of questions. I'll give you a taste of about 3 of them, right? And this went out purely to HR and EDI people. One of the questions I asked was, do you know how a belief is tested by the law? 50% of the people responding said no, and 29% said not sure. So only a very small proportion said, yeah, we do know. So that's a problem already, because if HR teams don't know how the belief will be tested by a tribunal, they may push a situation to end up at a tribunal without seriously considering it, and then end up losing, which is what's been happening. Another question I asked was, if a colleague holds a protected belief like some of the ones I listed earlier, and then if they express that they have that belief, do you think they will be treated or viewed fairly at your organization? 50% of the respondents said no, I don't think they would be treated fairly or viewed fairly at our organization. 50%. That's a really significant number. And another question that I asked was, do you think you have a culture where people might be afraid to express their personal and protected beliefs, like the ones I listed earlier? And 46% of the respondents said yes, people would be afraid, which means, and 33% said not sure. So that added up to, if I'm looking at the numbers here, that's 80% of people saying yes, they will be afraid, or not sure, maybe they'll be afraid. That's 80% of workplaces where basically that tells you psychological safety doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Psychological safety, and then to the point that you made earlier, and what I want to talk about now, is that kind of that leadership. You know, how are we driving the right behaviors? How are we holding, you know, how are we creating, you know, harmonizing potential conflict, essentially? So talk about some kind of practical tools or strategies that you help HR leaders with to, you know, address these conflicts between individual beliefs and organizational values without, you know, either compromising each other.
Yeah, so one of the things that my course on this topic helps HR teams do is understand when a conflict first comes up, how are they initially going to deal with it? Really, from the practical perspective, and also in terms of talking to the people involved. You know, so what should they be documenting? What do they need to check it against in terms of legal frameworks, you know, to ensure they speak to their lawyers? Because sometimes when I'm reading these tribunal cases, it makes me think that the HR teams didn't speak to their lawyers at all until the person then raised a grievance and said they've been treated unfairly by the HR team themselves.
Yeah.
You know, so doing a risk assessment as well, say, does this conflict pose any immediate risks to our colleagues? Are there potential impacts on other protected characteristics? Because sometimes it can lead to a clash between protected characteristics. Could this conflict affect service delivery or business operations? And what are the reputational risks? So really kind of looking at that initial assessment, and then going into a more analysis of the analysis phase where they're looking at stakeholder mapping. So who's actually affected by this conflict, and who might we need to speak to, whether that's an internal person or an external person, for example, the legal advisors, or maybe even union representatives, depending on what sort of organization you have. You have to do an impact analysis and say, this conflict, well, how does this affect workplace dynamics? Is this affecting a big team? Is it literally just two people that work in isolation with each other and no one else even knows what's going on? So this impact analysis needs to tease out information like, is this a back office issue or a front of house issue, whatever that looks like for any given organization. Even then, and then looking at resolution. So what are we going to do? What do we need to solve here? What accommodations might we need to make? Are there adjustments that we need to make for the people involved? Is the accommodation they're asking for reasonable? Can we actually implement this? And what's going to be the timeline for implementation? What resources might we need? You know, because if a relationship between two colleagues is completely broken down, well, that can happen. So now what is the organization going to do about that? Because the solution isn't necessarily going to be, well, get rid of one or both of them. So now what do we actually do? And this whole process helps them understand, okay, these are the things we're going to need to do, so that at no step of the way Are there knee-jerk reactions occurring? Because that's, again, what occurs. That teacher that I spoke about, she was questioned by her employer for 6 hours as though she was some sort of criminal. So employers also need to have a word with themselves and say, hang on a minute, how are we behaving here?
How can HR teams then kind of create, this culture of open dialogue, and this kind of critical thinking? You talk about it almost kind of, in some cases, it's too late. It's too late to even kind of draw, how do we implement kind of critical thinking, and navigate, the conflict between, beliefs and effectively, having diversity within the workplace?
It's very hard to preempt what sort of conflicts might come up, right? Because with every single person that joins, with every single person that leaves, the culture is going to change, because their internal sets of values are going to be different. You're not going to know about that until and unless a conflict arises. I had a client say to me once, well, surely our employer branding is very clear that no one who's got a belief that's that the HR team finds unsavory, well, no one would join here, surely, because we said we want inclusive people. So, well, that doesn't actually make any sense, because how are you going to test for that? First of all, that's a very discriminatory test, right? Or an approach, and someone could easily realize a belief they have once it is, I don't know, tested or prodded through the conversations that they have with someone. It may not even be something that's come up for them. Maybe they've never had to have a conversation about it. So you can't just say people won't apply here if they've got bad beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about kind of leadership? What role do they play in, setting the tone for balancing freedom of expression and organizational cohesion, I suppose? And how can HR support the leaders to do this?
So there's a couple of things, right? There's leaders need to be exhibiting the traits of inclusive leaders. So having an awareness of their biases, showing humility when they make mistakes, being curious about the people that work for them, talking about whatever element of inclusion is relevant to them, speaking about it, because you can't say to a leader, you should speak about everything. That's not realistic. But there'll be something around EDI that maybe does tap into them. It might be mental health, for example. It could be invisible disability. It could be any number of things. So to understand what role they can play in being a champion in a small area. But then they also need practical support, right? They need practical support from HR so that they understand what it means to actually demonstrate fair treatment to people, to actually demonstrate listening to people and asking the right questions, or just asking questions, demonstrating whether or not reasonable adjustments can be made. And I don't mean just in terms of disability, I mean just adjustments for people depending on what their specific needs might be. And that sort of environment then shows to people, okay, we can talk to each other about the things that we need. We will be held accountable for the things that we do. So accountability is really important. And the exhibition of positive behaviors. So all of this stuff, accountability, asking questions, listening to different points of view, even if we don't like the idea or the point of view, all of this can help us navigate these situations better if and when they come up.
Absolutely. And I know that we're nearly out of time. I want to ask you, what is it that businesses can now do if they want to engage with you in terms of, right, okay, I can see not only that this is potentially showing up in my workplace, or there is a high risk of it doing so. And just going back to the point I made earlier, we are living in a very VUCA world at the moment. Things are changing, and I think you just touched on it then, Hirao, in terms of, I have formed a view, I have formed a belief. These things are ever evolving. These aren't necessarily things that you're necessarily taking from childhood. These are real life things that are really like, real life, real time happening in the world, and people are forming, opinions and beliefs on them. So how, how can businesses protect themselves? what's the work that you specifically do with them to kind of help them through this transition and essentially future-proof themselves to mitigate the risks associated with conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important that HR teams in particular are able to take a step back and say, okay, this cannot be about good or bad. We're here to support the business as well as support the colleagues. So let's take the sting out of these conversations within our own team, at least, and say, this is about mitigating risks, right? Risks to the culture as well as risks to the business. So reputational risk, financial risk. And the way that I help them is actually taking them through this thinking exercise through my workshop around how we can so easily get caught up in this good and bad, black and white thinking, and how that isn't going to serve them, and what they can do instead, like you said, critically thinking through situations so that you can then actually handle the conflicts that are likely to be coming up. The world's getting more polarized. These conflicts are going to increase in number in the workplace, because what we see happening in society, that will filter through into workplaces. Of course it will.
Yeah.
So that's how I help them. It's a 2-hour workshop, but also a session workbook, a recommended reading list, and access to my Dismantling Bias digital learning course, so that they get that side of things too, that they can go, okay, clearly this good or bad thinking is related to biases. So now how do I interrupt or learn to interrupt my biases? Because you can't resolve these conflicts if you come at it from a place of your presuppositions and all your assumptions that this is good, this is bad, so this is fine, and this we've got to deal with and throw the book at it. It's how are they going to have proportionate responses? And that's what I'm really helping my clients with.
Incredible. Thank you. Well, I'm glad the world is filled with people like you that, want to help businesses on this journey. I think, we are, and we have to continue striving towards having psychological safe places, because if you've got those, the risk of conflicts is much, it's reduced. Greatly reduced. So thank you for the work that you do. Everyone who's interested, get in touch with Hiral directly. Like I said, I've been privy to her sessions and the work she does, and she really is a game changer in this space. So thank you for your time. And I'm sure we'll pop up again in the next couple of weeks with something else to talk about. You are the queen of kind of workshops and really kind of helping businesses through these really tricky things because of the depth of knowledge that you've got, and you really kind of do deep dives on this stuff, so we don't have to. So there's a huge amount of confidence that you're instilling in the world, in the workplace. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you hopefully again in a couple of weeks.
See you soon. Bye, Sally.
Bye.